from the shifting shadows of imagination to the blinding light of terror. This is One Tale to Midnight.
My great-uncle died back in 1987, and with me being his only family, I was left with everything. I was 20 at the time, and coming into a windfall of money probably wasn't the best for a man my age, but that's a different story. This one is about what I found in my uncle's belongings. It was a confession. His house was a large 2-story Victorian with 4 bedrooms and 3 bathrooms. It was full of old furniture, like a time capsule from 1950. I always heard my parents talk in hushed tones about him and the years following. I met him a few times as a kid, but the big guy with a long beard always reminded me of a pirate, tough and scary. His house was clean and organized, which made my job of clearing it out a lot easier. I found a diary while going through the stack of papers he had kept. It was a book filled with his memories, from World War II to his wedding and the birth of his only child, Beth. I read through most of his writings, which were very humorous and at times traumatic. What few stories I heard from my family of my Uncle Alan, I couldn't picture him writing some of the anecdotes I was now reading. He had a way of putting a funny spin on the most disturbing situations. And yeah, several stories got a belly laugh out of me. It made me wish I had known this man. Story after story was filled with the most intense circumstances and unexpected outcomes. He told stories from his youth until he started his family. There were even stories my other family members would be embarrassed to know I knew of. I spent more time reading his stories than clearing out his house. And honestly, the more I read, the less of his belongings I wanted to throw out. I discovered who this man was by his words and looking through his old photo albums. As I reached the book's last pages, I wondered what had happened to his family. There were stories of him and Thelma, his wife, camping, working on the house, gardening, and Thelma's pregnancy, but the book pages went empty on October 25th. I thumbed through it again, and that's when I noticed that on the back cover there was a map. It was hard to make out like it was written in pencil, then erased, leaving behind a shadow. It was a drawing of a hope chest with a secret compartment at the very bottom. To say I was intrigued was an understatement. So, I began to search the house for the hope chest. There was no sign of it in all the rooms and floors. I ventured into the attic, and there it was, just waiting for me to discover its secrets. Upon lifting the lid, a smell of mothballs filled my nostrils, reminding me of my grandmother's closet. Inside was a treasure trove of my great-aunts and uncle's mementos, their wedding photos, his uniform, and her wedding dress. It struck me as a beautiful memorial of times long past. Medals he was awarded, Thelma's garter belt, and her white elbow-length satin gloves. However, I wasn't looking for these forgotten memories. I was looking for the X mark on my map. Moving all the history from the box, I discovered what I had been searching for: a false bottom. The diagram on the map pointed me to a hidden lever disguised within the carved artwork on the exterior. With a twist of my hand, there was a pop, and the false bottom lifted up so it could be lifted away. As the remaining mothballs bounced on the floor, my eye caught an almost blinding glimmer. It was silver, and a lot of it. Bars and coins filled the bottom, along with expensive-looking pieces of Thelma's jewelry. The weight I felt seemed to be several pounds. I removed each piece, taking exceptional care of her brilliant love trophies. This discovery truly deserved the X on the map. I was impressed with all the different designs on the coins that dated back well over 100 years. The large stones glistened in their rich setting. It was a sight I never thought my eyes would see. This man's wealth is not protected in a safe, but guarded by memories. There was another hidden floor at the bottom of the hope chest. This one needed no special instructions, just a finger to slip into a hole and lift. There, I found the object I hoped to see: another story. The man was brilliant with a pen. In my mind, his words surpassed all the shiny things, and now I was reading his final story. It reads, "To Leo, the last of my blood. I hope you are well and have a family of your own. I say this because if you do have a family, like a little girl, you might understand what you are about to read. If not, please don't look bad upon me. But take it to heart. Maybe these words will serve you in the future. This is my confession of how I brutally murdered 18 people in the Great Smoky Mountains. The year was 1950, in late October. My wife Thelma, my daughter Beth, and I went on a camping trip for a week. Thelma loved the Smokies, and we spent several vacations there, exploring the hills, ravines, and waterways. She always talked about how they were one of the oldest mountain ranges on the planet. Beth, just 12, took after her mother's love of the Smokies. On our hikes, she could tell us in detail about the land's different fauna. Like her mother, the child was full of energy and had a strong drive to explore. From the day she was born, she was a daddy's girl. Thelma always laughed at the fact that our daughter was like her, full of love for the man in her life. It was the 25th of October when they went missing. Thelma and Beth left our campsite at 7 a.m. to walk to the stream to fetch fresh water. I was in the camper preparing breakfast and had not noticed the time. I was half expecting them to be sitting around the fire when I came out with all the ingredients for our meal. Thelma loved to cook over an open fire. She said it made her appreciate how our ancestors lived, and she was very good at it. When I came out, they had only been gone 15 or 20 minutes. I began setting things on our portable table, then stacked wood on fire to get it to the right height. About 10 more minutes had passed, and I began to wonder what was taking so long. So I headed down to the stream to help them. When I arrived, my eyes searched for them, but they were nowhere in sight. The pails Thelma used for the water were half submerged, and one of Beth's shoes lay on the bank. My heart began to race. I called out for them, but there was no reply. I searched for an hour, then returned to camp, jumped in the camper, and drove 3 miles away to the ranger station. After I told the ranger what I found, he made a report, marked the area on a map, and called search and rescue. The staging area was at our campsite. Thelma and Beth's pictures had been distributed, and by 3 p.m., the search had begun. Volunteers numbering in the hundreds started combing the mountain. I provided clothing so the dogs had a scent. I also called my brother Larry, who served in the Marines hunting down Nazis after the war. Larry was 2 years younger than me and had a reputation as a hot-headed SOB. This was not too flattering to our mother, but ask our father, and he would tell you she didn't take guff from anybody. After speaking to the ranger, Larry arrived just as the search began. He was by my side the whole time. We tracked up and down the creek, looking in every nook and crevice. Then, as the sun set, we heard over the radio that the search was suspended for the night. In the camper that night, I struggled to fall asleep. My mind was racing with the what-ifs, and fear had permeated every cell of my body. I was being torn apart, missing the people I held most dear. My dreams were filled with visions of terror. A man lurking in the shadows that was chasing Beth and Thelma, screaming in the distance. I could feel my spirit breaking to the point where I awoke with tears of rage. The next morning was much the same. Searchers calling out Thelma and Beth's names and dogs barking. After the first few days, everyone fell into a routine. Groups of volunteers searched their designated area for that day and then returned to base that night. There was no trace of my wife or daughter for the first 5 days. Then, over the radio, there came a voice saying they had found something. The area was about a mile south of Larry and I, so we hustled to the area marked on our map. There were about a dozen men gathered around the site, and all heads turned toward us as we approached. One of the local deputies broke off from the group and stopped us from approaching. The expression on his face sent chills up my spine. One of the park rangers approached and said the sheriff was on his way, and he would tell me what they found, but Larry wasn't having any of it as he pushed past the ranger. I watched as the group lowered their heads when Larry walked past. He scanned the area and then called for me. I walked up the hill to where Larry was standing, and immediately, my heart sank. Blood was splattered everywhere, and in the middle was Beth's other shoe. I fell to my knees, realizing that this might have been the place where Beth had died. Larry knelt down, put his arm around me, and said, "Just because there's blood doesn't mean they're not alive." His words did little to stop the fear that laid siege within me. The leader of the search party reorganized their efforts to begin from this spot, hoping to find any evidence of the direction they might have been taken. And yes, we were now working on the assumption that Thelma and Beth were taken against their will by someone or something. Larry told me it had to have been people, because animals wouldn't have drugged off two people, and they were a lot messier when they did. The sheriff felt that way as well, and he brought me back to base and questioned me about the circumstances of the day I last saw my family. Questions like, if I heard anything that morning, did I see any suspicious people the days leading up to that morning, and the question I dreaded to hear him ask, how was Thelma's and my relationship? Did we argue or fight a lot? Things of that nature. I knew these might have been standard questions in a missing persons case, but it still made me angry. I told him no, I didn't hear anything out of the ordinary, and no one I could point to as suspicious. Thelma was the love of my life, and Beth was our pride and joy. He questioned me for an hour, sometimes berating me and making accusations, until I snapped. I jumped up from the chair, saying he was wasting our time and that I was leaving. He told me that I wasn't going back out there to search for my family, and I was a possible suspect in a murder case. I told him the only way he could stop me was with handcuffs, and with that, I turned and left. Larry was waiting outside for me and could tell I was on fire. He asked me what had happened in there. But before I answered, I noticed a deputy standing guard at my camper. The door was open, and other deputies were taking all my belongings and putting them in boxes. Larry said they started that 20 minutes ago, and after I told him about the sheriff's line of questioning, he got really mad. Then the sheriff came out and said he couldn't stop me from searching, but my camper was going to be taken as evidence, and he handed me a warrant. Larry flipped out, yelling and cursing at him, telling him that he was a lowlife and that we would sleep in the woods if we had to. They towed my camper and took all Thelma's possessions to town, leaving me helpless. Larry slapped my back and told me to follow him. We jumped in his truck and headed out of town. On the drive down the mountains, I asked him what he had in mind. He said, "Well, big brother, I'm taking you to my place. We got some gear to load, and I will tell my wife to look after my business." He backed into his driveway, and I opened his garage door. He walked to the back and began pulling all kinds of camping gear out and chucking them in the bed of his truck. Though a week had passed since he came to help me, after the way they took everything and the interrogation I went through, he seemed more determined to help, if that were possible. After loading up a ton of gear, I followed him inside, where he opened up his gun cabinet, handing me a short-barreled pump-action shotgun, a .45 automatic pistol, and a belt with a holster and a knife. "Here, use these," he said, as he grabbed his M1 Grand Rifle and his prized Colt .45 Auto, along with several boxes of ammunition. I knew what he had on his mind. We were going hunting, but not for animals. He said, "We are going to find out what happened to Thelma and Beth. Then we're going to make them pay." We jumped in the truck, after putting all the weapons behind the seat. I knew Larry would stay until the end of this nightmare, and his state of mind gave me hope. We were going to find some answers. When we arrived at the staging area, the volunteers were pulling out. They told me the search had been postponed because they found a wild-looking man in the area. The sheriff took him to town for questioning. Larry said it seemed like they were getting somewhere, so we headed to town to find out what the man might have said. We arrived at the sheriff's office just in time to see this trashy, long-haired, old, dirty, wild man leaving out the front door. We ran inside to ask the sheriff what he found out. He told us that the guy lived in the mountains, homeless more than likely, and had nothing to say about the case. I asked why he hadn't detained him. He said he didn't have any reason to. At that moment, Larry stepped up and asked why the search had been suspended. He said that they didn't have the resources to keep it going, but there would be rangers and a handful of volunteers out looking.
Before I could say anything else, Larry grabbed me by the arm and pulled me out of the sheriff's office. We headed for his truck in a hurry, Larry telling me to get in. I asked him what he was thinking, and he told me his plan. He wanted to leave the office, since we weren't getting anywhere, and follow the guy they let go. We found him, walking on the side of the road, and drove past him. "He's headed back to the mountains," I said. Larry agreed as we passed him and went about a mile ahead. We parked out of the way, gathered our gear, and waited. A short while later, the guy came walking down the road. From our hiding spot, we had a good view of him. Larry said we'll watch and see where he goes, and as soon as he gets to the woods, we'll get our answers. Larry and I remained undetected as we watched him. We trailed for about 8 miles as he walked on the roadside, then cut across the road and into the mountains. We followed him for about 8 miles, over ridges, valleys, and across a stream. Once on the other side, Larry pointed at a large oak tree and said we would leave most of our gear here, and we proceeded with some rope and our weapons. We had been following this scruffy old guy for what seemed like hours when he stopped. Then he turned, looking around the area for something. I told Larry he could probably sense us watching him. Larry nodded in agreement. We stayed quiet, not wanting to give ourselves away. And just then, like it was by the divine hand of God, a doe came by crashing through the trees not more than 30 yards from our crouched position. It ran up the mountain. Then as the doe spotted the wild man and changed its direction, disappearing deep into the forest. As that happened, Larry pointed in the opposite direction and said, "Go." The wild man watched with an amused look on his ugly face, then turned and continued up the mountain. With all the commotion, Larry and I circled around toward the guy's original direction, hoping to get ahead. There, we lay in wait. Moments later, the scraggly guy walked down the game trail. We waited as he approached our hiding spot, and then Larry whispered, "What's next, Alan?" Since this is a confession, I will not lie. An insane amount of rage overcame me, to the point I felt like I was no longer in control of myself. The guy was 3 feet from our position when I attacked, lunging at him with all my being, knocking him to the ground, hard. I leaped on him, drawing my knife and jamming it to his throat. The look on his face told me that he wasn't expecting an ambush, as fear and confusion showered his disfigured face. Then Larry, in a flash, was by my side holding him down. His eyes shifted wildly from me, then to Larry. I was so lost in anger that I couldn't speak. I didn't know if this nasty-smelling person had anything to do with my missing family, but in my mind, and at that moment, I wanted to kill this man. Larry punched me in the arm, jarring me out of my state of insanity. Then I heard Larry's voice. "Where are the women?" he yelled, and with that, I regained my faculties. The truly ugly man yelled back, "What women?" With that answer, I pushed harder on his throat with my knife. Larry, seeing this, yelled again, "Where are the women?" His eyes shifted wildly, and his breath became shallow. I told the sheriff I didn't know anything. I told Larry to hold him down as I removed my knife from his throat. Larry put his knee on his neck as I bound his hands. We brought him to his feet, and then we took him down a small gully and tied him to a tree, where the questioning began. He said he didn't touch my wife and daughter. With his every denial, my blood ran hotter, and Larry was becoming angry. At this moment, I began to feel like I did years ago when I was in combat, and my adrenaline was coursing through my veins. My heart was racing. I started to beat the guy senseless, punching his face and stomach. After several hits, I asked again what he knew. He said, "I don't know nothing about Beth and Thelma." "Well, how do you know their names?" Larry asked through his grinding teeth. I bent down and picked up a large stick, then drew it back like I was going to smash a baseball out of the park. Just then, Larry stopped me. "The guy won't talk if he's unconscious," he said. He took my makeshift club and told me he had done this kind of thing before. With his words, I relented and allowed him to take over questioning. Larry knelt down while taking his knife from its sheath, then began cutting the dingy laces of the man's shoes. The man asked in a panic, "What are you doing?" Larry didn't reply and continued to cut one lace at a time. Then he jerked the guy's leg up and removed his shoe. As the guy regained his balance, Larry pulled his dirty sock from his foot. The guy said, "I told you I don't know nothing." Larry calmly stood back up and peered deep into his eyes before jamming his sock into his mouth. The man began to scream, but the sound noise had been muffled. Larry again knelt down with his knife and began to slowly dig and twist at the joint of the guy's pinky toe. Blood started to pool. Without looking up, Larry said, "You took a piece of our family. Now I will take a piece of you if you don't tell us what you know." The guy's screams fell to a low whimper. He shook his head in defense. "Well then," Larry said, We'll start with this one." And with a jab, the guy's toe popped off. His muffled screams rang out. Larry stood back up, cleaning his knife on the guy's chest, then grabbed the man's left pinky finger. The guy was still screaming through the sock, his eyes wincing in agony. Larry placed the knife between the guy's fingers. He made a slice in the skin between the fingers and jerked hard on his pinky. "Tell us," Larry shouted, looking into his eyes. The guy was moaning, and tears began to run down his cheek. Larry dug the knife in deeper. That's when the muffled okays came from underneath his gag, his head nodding. Larry took the tip of his blade and rested it on his cheek. The guy's eyes strained to see the knife's tip as Larry jerked the sock from his mouth, staring directly into his eyes. Larry whispered, "Speak up." His voice was full of pain and fear as he spoke. "My brother and nephews were down there by the crick and saw your womenfolk. They took them, not me." Larry pressed harder on his cheek with the knife. "Where?" he shouted. "Back to the cave," the guy said. Larry looked over at me. His face reflected the disdain he had for this man. "Take us there," Larry demanded. The guy nodded his head, and Larry cut him from the tree, leaving his hands bound. Larry stepped back, drawing his pistol. We watched the guy pull his sock over the bleeding nub and slowly put his shoe on. I grabbed the guy by his collar and shoved him, saying, "Move." With our guns slung over our shoulders and pistols drawn, we followed the guy deeper into the woods. His limp hadn't slowed him down too much. An hour had passed when the guy stopped and pointed down into a holler. "That's it," he said. I strained my eyes to make out an opening at the bottom of the rock face. It was partially hidden by bushes and a couple of dead logs that had been used to camouflage the opening. I kicked the back of the guy's knees, sending him dropping to the ground. I leapt on his back and buried the barrel of my .45 into his temple. "How many people are in there?" I said. "There are 30 of us." He spoke in a whispered tone. Larry asked, "What were you planning to do with them?" "Nothing, I swear," he shouted. I cupped his mouth, holstered my pistol, pulled my knife out, then jammed my blade into his thigh. He twisted and tried to scream through my fingers, but I gripped tighter. "Tell me what you were going to do with them," I shouted in his ear. He muffled, "Okay," came from between my fingers. I pulled the knife from his thigh and removed my hand from his mouth. "We were going to take them as wives," he said through heavy breaths. But on the way back, Thelma hit Samuel with a rock and Pete cut that bitch's throat. The man laughed. I grabbed his hair, jerking his head back. "Thelma's dead?" I asked. "Yeah, that bitch thought she could fight her way free. Now she ain't nothing but stew," he chuckled. I lost it. I took my knife and shoved it through his neck, in one side and out the other. I pushed hard on the knife until his throat opened, blood spraying from his nearly decapitated neck. Larry didn't flinch after seeing what I had done. He knelt beside me. "Now what, Alan?" he asked. My eyes filled with tears as I looked over the small valley to the cave. "I'm gonna get Beth and kill all those sons of bitches," I said. "Sounds good. How do you want to do it?" he asked. We stood up and began making our way over to the mouth of the cave. "Find some cover over there," pointing at the bush just on the other side of the valley. "Then kill everyone that comes out," I said. Larry nodded. "And you?" "I'm going to chase them out," I replied. I waited until Larry was in position, then with a shotgun in hand, I ran into the cave. The smell of that place was awful, like death. It was dark, and before my eyes could adjust, I saw a large bearded man walking toward me. He was about the same age as the man I had just killed, maybe his brother Pete. I shouted, "Where's my daughter?" He didn't answer. Instead, he made some grunting sounds and then charged me. I pulled the trigger, almost taking this giant's head completely from his shoulders. Then, more men came charging at me from the shadows. I turned and ran for the cave exit, but 2 men came out from one of the cave's branches before I could reach it. They stood there, blocking my path. I turned the shotgun on them and fired, hitting the taller one. I jacked the pump action and aimed at the other man, but he turned and ran out of the cave. I heard Larry's rifle fire in the distance, telling me he had dropped the man who had run out. I leaped over the guy I shot and turned back toward the others, coming from deep within. I began to empty my shotgun into the charging crowd. I had dropped 4 more before my shotgun was empty. I drew my .45 and started killing everything that moved. I emptied magazine after magazine. The flash from its muzzle lit up my next target. When I was down to my last magazine, I ran for the exit, the horde of cave dwellers on my tail. They hadn't given a second thought to the dying, as they charged after me. Once outside, I found cover, and turned to see the bizarre group of men and women pouring out of the cave. In the distance, I heard Larry's rifle firing round after round. He took out 2 or 3, and after reloading my shotgun, I leaped from my cover and fired on the 4 that remained. Larry was doing all he could and didn't miss a beat. I watched as his bullets dropped 2 more men before the chaotic scene had come to an end. Larry leaped from his cover and joined me at the entrance. 8 men and 2 women were scattered around the front of the cave. Some were still alive. Larry pulled out his pistol and began finishing them off one by one. When he was done, he looked at me and said, "Don't want none of these assholes trapping us in there." Then, spit on one of the dead men. We reloaded our guns before venturing into the darkness. Larry stopped me. "Wait for our eyes to adjust." I nodded. When their eyes adjusted, we saw 3 men and 2 women lay dead on the ground with various bullet wounds. We walked past them, moving deeper into the darkness. Then from around the corner we saw light. We approached with guns drawn. Larry peeked his head in, then turned back to me. "Coast is clear," he said. With guns raised, we stepped into a cavern. In the center was a fire burning with a large kettle suspended over it. In the back was a table covered in blood with some of Thelma's clothes piled on top of it. We searched the cavern. "Where the hell are they?" Larry asked. "I don't know," I replied. "Let's search the main cave." We took the torches that hung from the walls and made our way back to the main passage. Our search led us deeper into the void. Then there was a sound coming from ahead. A light flickered, and a strange voice came from around the bend. We cautiously approached, expecting that more of these troglodytes would appear at any moment. With my .45 in hand and the torch in the other, I charged around the corner, ready to kill anyone who wasn't Beth. There in the corner sat an old woman, her back to us. Larry joined me and said, "What the hell?" The old woman was pale with stringy, unkempt hair. She was to focus on whatever she was doing to notice us. Larry yelled, "Hey!" The old hag stood up. She turned, and there was a part of a child in her hands. She had been eating it. Shock overtook both Larry and I, and we began to fire. Her body jolted with each bullet, and then fell. This was a gruesome sight that lay before us. There were dismembered body parts of Thelma and Beth strewn about. Both my wife and child had been murdered, butchered, and partly consumed. I was frozen as Larry began looking through the pieces to discover my family's heads discarded in the corner. I was in a rage and began screaming. Larry stepped away from his discovery and turned toward me, horror covering his face. Then he threw up his pistol and fired over my shoulder. I turned to see even more of this cannibalistic family, and I began to fire. This time there were more women than men. We didn't hesitate. We killed everyone we saw. When it was over, we returned to the cave's opening. The sunlight burned our eyes. We walked silently back to the creek and the old oak tree where we had left the supplies. We washed our hands in the cool water. Larry was the first of us to speak. Who the hell were those people? I thought for a second, remembering the cave under the stone wall. The Stonies, I replied. Larry returned home, and I did the same. I never heard from the sheriff or the park rangers, which made me think they knew more than they let on. The truth is out. After reading the confession of my great-uncle, I sat there in silence, feeling so bad for him. How horrible to lose his wife and child like that. Now I understood the whispers of the family. I placed the papers back in the truck and closed the lid. And just so you know, I did get married a bit later, and my first child was a daughter, and we will never go camping, not ever.